Hello, and welcome to another installment of FIT Talks, the oral history program of the Fashion Institute of Technology, one of 64 campuses of the State University of New York. I am Associate Professor Karen Trivette, head of the FIT Library's Unit of Special Collections and College Archives, and this unit administers the FIT Talks program. We are coming to you today from the FIT campus on West 27th Street in Manhattan, New York City, USA. It is June 8th, 2021, and the time is 10:13 a.m. Eastern Time. I have the honor and privilege to be joined today by, I am sad to say, recently retired FIT Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dr. Giacomo Oliva. Dr. Oliva is coming to us today virtually from his home in Pennsylvania. Dr. Oliva, welcome to the program and thank you so much for participating.
Thank you, Karen. This is really a pleasure for me.
And for me, and I know our viewers as well. So let's dive in. For a little bit of context for our viewers, if you will, please tell researchers a little bit about your childhood.
Wow. Well, I was born in Lower Manhattan, and at a very early age showed a lot of talent and potential for music. My mother was a pianist. Her father, my grandfather, was a pianist. He had a life in Italy and in the United States as a musician and conductor. So my early days were, on the one hand, going to normal grade school in Manhattan, but also from the time I was 6, the youngest child they ever took at a school that is now non-existent, but it was then a very well-known school of music, the Chatham Square Music School, and it started prior to World War II, and it was run for many years by a gentleman named Sam Schatzenoff, who was married to the sister of Jascha Heifetz, and also was a very strong supporter of George Gershwin, and that's a long story. I can tell you, but I situate that because my years all through grade school were sort of a juxtaposition of living with kids in my neighborhood, but having this life on Saturdays studying music in this school. Over the years. And we moved into New Jersey from Lower Manhattan about the time I was 12 years old. And so until I finished grammar school, I was commuting in once or twice a week for the music.
Wow.
And then when I went to high school, I went to Xavier High School in Manhattan. So I was commuting into high school every day from New Jersey, and on Saturdays as well for music. So my early days were focusing a lot on music. I also was very normal in the sense that I also loved sports and played a lot of street baseball when I was a kid. And you know, when I eventually was sort of trying to understand where I would be going beyond high school, and I went through a period of not quite wondering what career in music was like. You know, and I think the dilemma for me in those days was my reference at the music school was really to prepare performers in the very strict conservatory sense. And it's not that I didn't enjoy the practicing in the music, I loved it. But for me, I found it to be a problem only from the standpoint that I wasn't sure I had the desire or the will to focus my life that finely. Plus, I had no sense other than that music school in terms of what I could do with music.
Well, and it seems it was asking an awful lot of maturity for a very young person to make these decisions.
Yeah, it was interesting because the majority of the kids that were with me in the music school went on initially and studied at Oberlin, and they studied at Juilliard, and they studied at Manhattan. And for me, I went to Montclair. I went to Montclair for lots of reasons. not the least of which was when I went for an orientation, the kids that I met there were interested. They loved their music, but they were interested in lots of other stuff too.
And Montclair is in New Jersey, yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
It's in Upper Montclair. It's now university. It was Montclair State College in those days. And the other side of me as a musician was, from the time I was in early high school, I was a rock and roll garage band musician. So
wow.
That was something that took my mother a while to accept, because she was very
well, it's rebellion is in the DNA.
But it also helped me understand that as a musician, I love all kinds of music, and I love playing a variety of different types of music. So when I was there trying to make a decision about what I wanted to do, the challenge was, what's in it to study music beyond being a concert performer, which I just at the time, I knew that wasn't going to be for me.
Okay.
Anyway.
So you mentioned rock and roll. Did you have another genre or a genre that just really spoke to you that you performed primarily in?
Not in those days. And then, I played in the 60s. We played what was on the radio, and then I played the classical music. And it wasn't until I went to college that I got more into jazz.
Yeah.
And as my abilities and my sensitivities as a musician expanded, you start to listen to more music and you start to experiment with music. I was fortunate to meet in college 2 or 3 musicians that today I still play with. We've been friends. In fact, since the pandemic, every Thursday night since a year ago, March, with maybe 5 exceptions, there's 4 of us that are on a Zoom every Thursday night, just staying together.
I love that.
But I was lucky. In college, I was able to study percussion as a minor.
Oh.
Piano was my primary. Because I did some rock and roll. I had learned the electric bass as a high school kid.
Wow.
And started to find ways to play. So much so that when Montclair prepared me to teach in the public schools, which was I looked at it in those days as a backup. Because I wasn't sure I wanted to do that, but it was tangible to me.
And to teach music.
That's correct. Yeah. But I also found that because I was versatile as a musician, I was able to do a lot of different things, and got, fairly competent enough as a percussionist to have a couple of years with the New Jersey Opera, playing in the pit and doing a bunch of other things when I finished college.
Wow.
So my life as a musician expanded in a very natural way. And I think it was because at Montclair, I had the space, the elbow room to do that. I was also with kids who grew up, in the same neighborhoods I grew up in, and their lives weren't so focused. To give you an example, when I was at Chatham at the music school, with me as a student, although younger than me, was Andre Schub, who was a Van Cliburn winner eventually.
Oh, wow.
Robert Levin, who's older than me, who was a Mozart scholar at Harvard, and 4 or 5 other people who became world-renowned musicians. But you know what they had to do with their lives to dedicate themselves to do that. And to me, I felt I was more versatile than that. And the final thing I'll say is, I was very fortunate with my parents. For me and my 2 younger sisters, they had their ideas. Mom would have been very happy if I went to Juilliard. She never pushed back on my decision to go to Montclair, and I'll remember she never quite understood when I worked in a supper club till 2, 3 in the morning with a trio until she came and saw me play. And they were always very supportive of whatever we wanted to do. And that was really sort of a family thing that I and my 2 sisters were really blessed to have with both my parents.
It is a blessing, because I can say virtually the same thing, and there's no substitute for it. I can't imagine.
Yeah.
So after Montclair, where did your education take you?
Well, I had to do when I was finishing up at Montclair, I became connected with Connie Francis. Those of you who might in that age group will know who I'm talking about. I was teaching. She had 2 children from one of her marriages, and I was teaching them piano. I was doing rehearsing with her, but I also had some Army Reserve stuff I had to do. So yeah, I finished. I did 6 months active duty. Then while I was doing that, I came right back and got a graduate assistantship at Montclair in piano and performance, and my master's degree. Got a high school choral gig, really on a whim. I wasn't sure I really wanted to do that out in Jersey. And as soon as I did that, I started in a doctoral program at NYU. And the reason I did that was because I was still single. I had time. The school district I was in reimbursed for part of the tuition if you were in a program.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And I figured, well, look, I chose between Columbia and NYU. NYU was more flexible in those days, back in the 70s. And I just did my doctorate part-time and finished it before I was 30. I mean,
amazing.
That was the goal. In fact, I typed my dissertation on an IBM Selectric the summer after I was married, and got it done in the summer because I knew once I went back to teaching in the fall at the high school, I'd never do it.
Yeah. So what was your dissertation on, if you don't mind my asking?
Yeah, I was working in a I don't want to get into too much detail on it, but it was an EDD, not a PhD, because I wanted to do something that had some practical application when it was done. New Jersey has an unusual organizational structure of its public schools, based on the funding and the townships and so on.
Sure.
And I was working in a regional district where there was very little, if any, coordination between curriculum in 3 or 4 or 5 elementary districts that fed that high school. High school was a district unto itself. It wasn't a system.
Gosh.
What I did was I took a look at music programs across all the state of New Jersey that in those types of structures. And through a series of surveys and conversations with people teaching music in those districts, I asked them how they were coordinating music experiences across district lines. That normally there's a lot of autonomy there, as you would expect.
Yeah.
And then I just created a structure for Morris Hills, the district I was in, based on that research. At the time, I think there was 30 plus regional districts in New Jersey, and I don't think the numbers changed much. Maybe 1 or 2 when they've combined townships or whatever they've done. And so that was the work. So it was the research on that and the application of that for the district I was in. I worked for 7 years in the high school. And had an opportunity to go to one of the township middle schools, separate district, but fed the high school. Took the gig. I just wanted the experience. And so I taught there for 3 years and got to see the other side of that, if you will. And then I continued, after I finished the doctorate, I continued another year at Seton Hall at night, in courses that enabled me to be certified as a principal. And I never quite finished, but I was working towards a superintendent as well, because in my mind at the time, administration was something that I realized I had strength in. I wanted to do that. And in order to do that in the public schools, in most states, you need special certifications to do it. So I was able to work out, as part of my doctorate, a lot of cross application of the courses I was taking that applied for the doctorate to the doctorate, but then I was also able to take those courses and apply some of them to the certifications for principal and superintendent. So that's sort of how it all evolved up until the next shift in my life. So yeah.
Well, don't leave us hanging, please. Well, what was the next shift?
I kept playing a lot, and I went through a phase after about 10 years in the public schools. I moved into a district supervisor of music in Leonia in New Jersey for a couple of years. But I think it was time I was realizing I needed to do something different. I had finished a doctorate. I was looking at college jobs in music teacher education, but the pay differential between public school and an entry-level college job in those days was, we couldn't exist. I was married. We started a family. And I was working actually with Connie Francis part-time on local stuff that she was doing, playing for her, etc. And so because of my connections with music, I decided, well, let me see if there's an alternative career here. So I looked around for a law school that would have part-time, that I could go part-time. Law schools don't normally do that.
Right.
Seton Hall at the time had a program that was 5 years, not 3.
Ooh.
And I applied. And I said, look, I could do this. I could continue to teach another couple of years, junior high school, whatever I was doing, be in my district, continue to play. But I had enough contacts in the music industry there that I figured I'd be able to work. So I applied to law school. I took the test. And at the same time, I got a nomination from my mentor at NYU for the music department chair's job at Mississippi State.
Wow.
And, I had absolutely no idea where Starkville, Mississippi was. I had never worked full-time in a college. I was an adjunct at NYU for a number of years once I finished the degree. So at the time I applied to law school, I applied for this job, and only because my mentor said to me, he, at the time, started his career in the 50s in Mississippi, and it was a progressive place in the 80s.
Oh, wow.
You want to look at this job. The deans know each other. What did I do?
Yeah.
Sent the application. So the way it turned out was I went for the interview and had a really good feeling about the interview, but I still couldn't imagine myself moving to Mississippi. We had a 3-year-old daughter. And got accepted to Seton Hall. And 2 days later, the dean offered me the job at Mississippi State.
Oh.
Seton Hall allowed me 1-year deferment on the acceptance, and I took it. And I said, well, we'll move to Mississippi. We'll keep the house in New Jersey, and we'll hedge our bets a little bit. And if we don't like it, we'll just come back, which, of course, we never did. So I moved back to New York for FIT 30 years later.
Oh, wow.
So, I got into higher ed then full-time in those days. And then my whole career in higher education and administration went as a result of that particular move. Fortunately, for many of those years, I was able to keep playing.
Oh, yeah.
Because as a faculty member in the music school, I had to have academic credibility. So I was able to continue to I did a lot of accompanying, which in the classical sense, which I love doing, and played through there. Back in the 70s, I also learned tenor banjo to do Dixieland music.
Oh, yeah.
So when I got to the University of Florida to run that school of music, they had a group of medical doctors called the Docs of Dixieland, who were schooled musicians, but they were medical doctors, and they raised money for charity and scholarships and so on. And when they found that I played the banjo, so the 9 years I was at Florida, I played with the Docs. So anyway.
So how long were you in Mississippi, and then you went to Florida?
Yeah, I was 7 years in Starkville as head of the music department. Then I was the director of the school of music at UF for 9. And then I moved on to be the fine and performing arts dean at Nebraska.
Oh, wow.
And that was 10. And
those are meaningful shifts.
Yeah.
Geographically and obviously career-wise as well.
Well, and the interesting thing was every one of them found me. I mean,
I love that.
You go on interviews and so on. And I used to say that from my very first job, including the high school job, every job I thought I really wanted, I never got. It's really odd, but that's the way it turned out. And one thing led to another. You get a nomination, somebody calls you, you figure, that's really not for me, but throw your hat in the ring. And Nebraska turned out, the year before I got the Nebraska job, I was the finalist for the dean's job at Penn State. And the guy who got that job vacated the spot in Nebraska. And the next thing you know, I was doing there a year later, you know.
Okay.
And the FIT thing was the same thing. I never thought of myself as a vice president. I loved being a dean. And back in while I was at Lincoln, I had entertained a presidency, college presidency, on a number of occasions. But you know, as the longer I spent and the longer I looked at the amount of 24/7 that required, with the family, and for me, I wasn't going to do it. So we were very content to stay in Lincoln and retire. The University of Nebraska it's a great school, and I connected early on with all the agriculture people and did a lot with the arts in rural Nebraska, which I loved doing. But then this nomination for the FIT job came up, and like all the others, I said, well, what do I have to lose? But the real magnet for me was getting us back to New York.
Yes.
And we knew we had to do that before I retired because of the cost and rooting your family and everything. And so that's how it turned out. It's
just amazing how the winds can push you in the right direction.
Yeah. You got to think, you know, we think in our lives, in our careers, we always think very unidirectional and vertically. Which makes sense because you're always trying to build and you think of building up, but we rarely feel as comfortable thinking flat.
Right.
And thinking this way and relying as much on peripheral thinking on directional thinking. And I think that causes us challenges with consensus building. It causes us challenges with shared governance, the things that we wrestle with in college. Because we have a tendency, for all good reason, to protect what we own, and so on. And probably the thing I enjoyed the most about my work at FIT was I used to say to you, somebody says, well, what's it like being vice president? And I says, well, you're responsible for everything and you own nothing. And I said that with no disrespect. I mean, it was about, and in FIT it was compounded because I had no academic home here.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Plus the non-bargaining piece, it didn't come with any faculty identity, which was a trouble for me. They almost didn't take the job. But in the end, it proved to be a blessing because in my role, I have to consciously remember that while I want to listen and align with certain things that are going on, I have to be in my role agnostic. And I always have to see myself looking at it very structurally first, and not getting too involved in it. And that was a great experience because it's something that when you're in a discipline, you have an academic home, when you're advocating for music or the arts, you work one way. And here, I wasn't able to do that, but that was a blessing in a sense that I learned.
Had you heard of FIT before?
Oh yeah. I knew about the school. I didn't know granularly about the school until I was looking at the job.
Right.
I knew it was part of, it was public school, it was part of SUNY, but again, I didn't know about the mechanics of the SUNY system till I looked at it. But I had known about FIT beforehand. So, in fact, there was a woman at Nebraska who I worked a lot with, who was in the College of Agriculture, but her specialty, they had some fashion program there, but not fashion in the sense of runway, more on the business side.
Okay.
There, but they also had a world-renowned quilt center there.
Oh.
And Rita Keene was involved with that, and she was connected and as was the chair of that department with things going on in the fashion world. And I remember saying to her, I said, Rita, I got this nomination for this job at FIT. I said, I know the school, but I don't see a match between performing musician and FIT. And she said to me, she's, Jack, you ought to look at that job. And, you know, I was lucky to have lots of great colleagues and always was comfortable with people's suggestions about stuff. Never worried about trying something that somebody suggested if it made sense to me. So that's really how it all played out.
Do you recall who nominated you?
Yes, but at the time I applied for the job, I had no idea. I have to tell you what I did. When I knew I was when I was thinking about applying for the job, I got this email from a search firm that I picked up on my phone. I got back home and I went on the FIT website and I said, well, my first instinct was that because they did have fine arts here, that there was a connection with NASAD. And NASAD and NASM and NASD and NAST are all part of the arts accreditation. I figured, well, maybe I know somebody there.
Yeah.
And I went through the entire website, faculty name I could find across the adjuncts, nobody.
Oh.
I called the executive director at the time, she wasn't the executive director yet of NASM. She was the associate, Karen Moynihan, who I've known for a million years, and try to pick her brain. That FIT, NASM, NASD, I couldn't figure it out. Well, all right, so I let it go. Then I got the interview, and Gretchen Bataille was the acting. She came.
Yes.
So when we got to talking, it turned out that Gretchen at one point had been the provost at Washington State University. And for a while, the woman who was the dean of liberal arts there eventually became the senior vice chancellor, the provost at Nebraska. In fact, I was on that search committee.
Oh, wow.
So I worked for Barbara for 5 or 6 years until she moved on. But as it turned out, talking with Gretchen, she nominated me. She gave Gretchen my name. Gretchen was chairing the committee. Gretchen was also the interim vice president. And I didn't find that out really till I came for the second interview and got talking with Gretchen about it, and realized that in addition, Gretchen at the time had gone from Washington State. She was the president at North Texas for 4 years and then came to New York. While she was there, she crossed paths with a dozen or more people who knew me because of the music school at North Texas. You know, these networks are
amazing.
They're very small.
Yeah.
And so that's how it was. And then I remember calling Barbara after to tell her I was thinking about the job, and she says, "Yeah, I'm the one who nominated you." And, you know, but it was a complete mystery to me because I had no idea how they could ever have gotten my name because there was no performing arts piece.
Right.
How would they know me? You know,
I found it mysterious as well.
Yeah.
So hence the question. So you're firmly planted at FIT. What year is that you
2011.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. What are some of your early impressions starting out here at FIT?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I was surprised for a school that had so much of its integrated DNA from the beginning, that the structures that had evolved over the years were very, siloed is an overused word. I don't quite mean it's siloed because siloed implies that people don't talk to each other. They do talk to each other.
Absolutely.
And so it was more that there were so many structures that the ability for the college, as I looked at it at the time, to take advantage of its integrated history between the the fashion piece and the business and the manufacturing and production piece from the 40s was hindered by all that structure.
Mm.
And so for me, I found it curious. And so without being judgmental, it was a learning curve on how you balance and engage people across those lines,
Mm-hmm.
with then also not coming to at crossroads with the contract.
Right, right.
Now, don't get me wrong. I still carry my local 802 union card from New York. I got it when I was 18, and I paid those dues for 58 years because I believe in the unions, and I think they have every right purpose for the things they do.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was not about the UCE. For me, it was understanding, when I looked at the bargaining agreement, it's a very complex animal.
It is.
How do you work within that and do things that instinctively I was able to do in other places, which is get people around the table, figure something out, get it done,
Mm-hmm.
and fix it as you go. And I just found that curious. And so as a first impression, it was balancing that against the other piece, which became very apparent very quickly, was that the people who work here love this place. They have a loyalty to this place. There's a president here who's devoted, a major piece of her career to this place. And in spite of other structural things, the place has prevailed. And it was really about the people who were here.
Yes.
And, one of the hardest things about leaving an institution, and I've done that many times, is the possibility that you'll leave those people that you've worked with and you've developed relationships with, and through your work have gotten to know about you as a person directly or serendipitously. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember somebody saying to me, I remember saying to somebody when I said I was going to retire, when I started to talk with different groups, I said, this is really hard. It's much harder than I thought.
Oh.
But I slept on that and thought back, and I said, it should be hard. Because if it's not hard after 10 years, you stayed too long.
Yes.
And you didn't give enough of yourself to the place. Now, this is not about me, Karen. I'm not boasting about myself, but it helped me reinforce to me the people that I've worked with here, whether they've only been here 3 years with me or they've been here 30 years and worked with me for 10 of those 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so that impression has stayed with me for the whole time. Then the final thing I'll say is, we're in this giant public system, SUNY.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for better or worse, FIT is there's an aura about this school and the system that you got to experience it from working with other people in the system, just to hear them talk about it, to see the questions they ask you. And my work mostly with the chief academic officers for the 10 years I've been in the system. And you would know it from working with the librarians and so on. It's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's this aura about FIT and it's one of respect.
Yes.
It's not about, look at that aloof school over there. It's really
one
of respect. You really get a sense of, I'm glad I worked there.
Yes. Yes.
And so those impressions have stayed with me, and really they've carried me through all the mechanical stuff you do in these jobs.
Mm-hmm.
The paperwork and the budget and all that stuff. All that stuff is doable. Tedious
Mm-hmm.
is if when you come to work, you're in a family, you're in a community, and you really feel that here.
Absolutely.
And of course, in my office in 913A, we have that there, and so it's a place where we still enjoy coming to work.
Absolutely, and I have been a visitor in your family in 913A enough to know how wonderfully connected everybody seems to
Mm.
be.
Mm.
Just on special projects with them, it's just a beautiful community in and of itself.
Well, there's a real generosity of spirit in that office.
Very much so.
People do what they have to do for each other and for the school, and so that has stayed. You see that in all the different pockets at FIT.
Yes. Yes.
And that's a real, it's a blessing to work at a place that has that, because I've been in other places where it's just not a happy place to work.
Right. Right.
So you have a comparison.
When you reflect on your 10 years here, do you think of certain projects or initiatives that stand out as successes that you'd like to recall to our viewers?
Yeah, I think, holistically speaking, because all of these are still works in progress, getting people at least to sit around the table and think across the disciplines. To me, that is something that I still see it as a hidden attribute that FIT has, and I think they should exploit it more than they do, because there's a definite reason to do it, but I think there's a really big desire to do it. I think we get in our own way. Again, none of this is with disrespect. So for me, I think it's the things that have stood out to me in a global sense have been when, either by myself or working in partnership with others, have been able to get people around the table and have a conversation that starts with them giving something up before they take something away. And that spirit of wanting to try, wanting to share, wanting to work together in spite of differences, and then creating an environment for them where they can express the differences without all the personal baggage that comes along with that when people express their differences. And I just take that away from FIT generally, because that's one of the things that makes shared governance difficult. People get caught up in, for whatever the reason, their own frame, and it gets in the way.
Yeah, so, it's obstructive.
Yeah, and it does it very subtly. I mean, it's corrosive, actually, if you're not careful. So for me, if I think of its successes, they all seem to fit within a context of trying something new. The success or failure of the initiative is less important to me as an educator than is the ability to try something and struggle with it for a while.
Yeah.
And the frame for me has always been the balance between higher education oftentimes not wanting to do that, particularly in the arts, and being in a discipline that can't exist without it, if that makes sense. So a composer who doesn't struggle with putting the notes down over time is not going to create great music. A visual artist who doesn't struggle, fail's a bad word. Fail has negative connotations. That's not willing to take a risk.
Yes.
And not for every risk, what's in return. I don't know that people like that can create great things. And the frame for me is artistic things. So as I think about it, when work I did alone and with others was able to engender this sense of taking a risk and trying and not worrying about whether the money's there or not worrying about the contract for the moment. What is it you really want to try to do?
Yes.
That to me, where I can look back on that as a frame that I was able to contribute to over 10 years, to me, that's how I view my success. And it's very similar to the frame of a teacher. I've always gone back to the teacher-parent metaphor for me. Holding your child up as they try to walk is not as advantageous as creating a safe environment and letting them walk around and fall down every once in a while. And the joy is when they can do it themselves and walk away That is the thing. So when you create an environment where faculty create something, take the risk, take a few punches in the nose, come to you for help, whatever it is, but then own something and walk away with it,
Mm-hmm.
create something different from that. That's the teacher who says, well, when the students know how to take what we've done in the classroom on their own and make those decisions and ask the right questions, that's success. So I try to look at my work here, not unlike I've looked at it at other places, in that sort of box.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, one such box I think of, our paths have crossed over time, is the open mic night.
Yeah.
Loved those and hope it can re-emerge out of the pandemic.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful example. It was not my idea at all. This was an example. It was suggested by more than one faculty member as part of the conversations around that earlier strategic plan.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, we had that space at the Opera Center that we pay a couple of $100 a year to be a member. And this sort of making it happen was a piece that you could say what I or my folks did, but
Mm-hmm.
the idea was a faculty idea. Calvin was in that, CJ, and there must have been a half a dozen faculty that were talking about that concept.
Yeah.
And it was creating an environment that did not have a disciplinary boundary in that room.
Exactly.
Didn't matter what department you're in. We want to know the work you're doing. We want to know how your person connects with the work. And I think about Amy Werbel as one example.
Oh, good one.
Of watching her journey as a scholar through a series of those night nights, So I hope that continues. I mean, we did that. The last open mic we did was literally a week before the college shut down.
Amazing.
I remember saying that Joyce and I had one of our one-on-ones, and I told her it was the day after the open mic, if I'm remembering right, and told her that, in spite of all this business, we had open mic last night and there were 50 people, and she sort of looked at me like, and I know what she was thinking. She was like, what in the world are you doing there?
Super spreader.
What did we know? But
exactly.
It was always a fun night, and because of the connection with the library, who was so instrumental in doing all the sort of social piece of that, which was half the battle.
Oh, loved that series, and again, hope it returns after we find our place, ourselves in a safe place again.
Yeah.
Another example where our paths crossed was at a time, I'm non-classroom faculty at FIT, and the whole tenure and promotion piece, it can be mysterious for non-classroom faculty. And working with you and others around the table from different non-classroom faculty units or divisions or departments, it was great to sort of demystify that process and give my colleagues, and myself, a sense of mission. So,
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the sort of precursor to that was about the second or third year I was here. I think James was the Senate president at the time. He and I had been talking about, if we could create a statement about what's expected for tenure and promotion, that would be great. So I put that statement together, and it became a real go-to. But after it, we didn't know what to do when it came to the non-classroom faculty, and everything was so clear. And my position has always been, it's not about whether we should have non-classroom faculty or not, or it's the right term. It means nothing to me. The college is committed to non-classroom faculty. The college allows the opportunity for them to be promoted equally. Then we need to develop a framework to facilitate that. And so Kelly and I decided to pull that together, and it took us about a year and a half. But it was really good, because we developed a matrix that now, for the moment, allowed for the individual units to articulate what was important to them, and it pushed back against any attempt for a one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
And it was another example of getting people to think conceptually about what this means as going above and beyond your day job. How are you developing your own professional profile? What are you contributing to the larger conversation? And suddenly when you start to take away what the jobs are and then understand the concept and talk about the concept, the examples pop right off the table.
Yep.
You know, and so it took us a while, but that was well worth the effort.
Absolutely.
I was.
Me too.
Yeah.
And I appreciate being a part of that. So,
Yeah.
Segueing a little bit back to the personal side of things, or maybe professional as well, what person would you say had the most positive influence on your life, and what did he or she do to influence you?
Yeah, I remember seeing that in one of the questions you sent me, and I can't look at that in a singular fashion, because we're all complicated people. So
Yes.
I see it from various angles. Certainly my parents, and for my parents who said to me, "We don't really care what you do, but don't go halfway. If you decide you're going to turn left at the corner, then turn left and move on and do some good stuff." And there was always a support, knowing that as long as I could acquit myself in terms of my effort, that they would support me. And that's the way they were with my sisters as well. I had a couple of mentors over the years. When you study a musical instrument, you become very close with your teacher. And I had if I look at my 12 years in my K-12 days, and then my college days of bachelor's and master's, it comes out to about 18 years. I only had 3 piano teachers in 18 years.
Wow.
And one of them was with me from the time I came to that school as a 6-year-old for 11. Another one in the space, and then the person who taught me the years I was at Montclair, who was wonderful. And so they all had an influence on me. But if I think about beyond school and look professionally, there were 1 or 2 mentors. One I think I might have referenced in the answering the question, who had said to me, when I got the doctorate, I was puffed up. Here I was, 29 years old. I was going to call everybody under the sun about having done this. And I get to this one gentleman who at the time was, I don't remember if he was retired or not, but he had been a supervisor of music in Bergenfield, New Jersey for many years, had been a junior high school principal there. And he was my mentor one of my mentors on the administration side of things. And I called him and he listened to me, so on and so forth. And then, of course, you've reminded me that now, because I had this title, now I have to be prepared for people who are going to look to me for answers, and I better have some answers.
Yes.
And I better be well rehearsed. And the immediate shift of the responsibility that came with that title, and you could translate that to a job that, so somebody's the president or somebody's the dean or somebody's the provost. You really have to be prepared to, at least, if not have the answer, bring people around in a way to come to that answer.
Right.
So he had that I've always remembered that story. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I did a commencement address at for the School of Music at Illinois or somewhere, where I referenced that in an oblique way. But when I was thinking about what I was going to say, that jumped right off the page. But I mean, it's hard for me to pinpoint one person, because I've worked with and for, Joyce has been wonderful. I've learned so much from her. And my immediate supervisors in my previous jobs on administration have all impacted who you are. You have to be open to that. You have to continue to feel it's okay to be a student.
Yes. I was thinking the word student as you were talking, thinking that is the perpetual role.
It is. When you come to FIT, you get to pick a word on your card.
Yes.
And I put learning on mine, and it was not about learning for the students. It was learning for me.
Mm-hmm.
That,
Mm-hmm.
the more you continue to want to learn about things, your curiosity, and feel comfortable asking questions, in the end, it's the better way, at least through my lens, it's the
Yes.
better way to be. And so now you leave yourself open to many mentors,
Mm-hmm.
people who have influence in your life. And aside from parents, because that's a special relationship,
Right.
obviously, and my life partner, I mean, my wife, we've been married 42 years in another
Oh.
2 weeks. And without going into a lot of detail about what I've learned from her,
Mm.
about myself, and about and how it's helped me all these years,
Mm.
self-critical. It's helped me be acknowledge shortcomings more easily and more readily. It's all those things that you hope that relationship will give. I don't want to forget that, because that's
Right.
more than half my life that we've spent together, and that's been major.
Oh, congratulations on that. That's wonderful. Um, so another question I tend to ask interviewees in these conversations is, what book influenced you the most? And I know that can be difficult for some people, so I'm going to twist it a little bit for you and ask, what musical piece and or composer has had a great impact on your life?
That's a little bit musical piece. I don't know,
Okay.
but I probably can tell you that of all the composers that and if I again, I have to segment this by style.
Mm-hmm.
I look in the classical realm. Of all the composers that I've studied, played, probably the one I enjoy listening to and find the most challenging to play is Brahms.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Brahms was a masterful orchestrator, among other things, as a composer. Um, but I still will go back to some of the great works that his four symphonies, his second piano concerto. When you listen to the musical workings of that,
Mm.
he was masterful with orchestras. And what I always found really fun and challenging, and still do, was when you play his piano works or play accompaniments where there's piano piece, where the piano does not sustain sound like a voice or a string does, but so much of his rhythmic structure crosses over bar lines, and he creates sort of elasticity. And
Oh,
so
wow.
playing the music on the piano is, how do I think that as a player, as if I'm an orchestra and not a pianist? And where I've drawn on that the most is the accompanying that I've done with opera.
Mm.
A bunch of years ago, I haven't done much opera since I left New Jersey. But back in the '80s, I was pianist and assistant musical director for a group called Opera at Florham,
Mm.
and it was connected with Fairleigh Dickinson University over in New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have anything to do with the final performances, but I was the rehearsal pianist for the operas.
Oh,
And
wow.
so for me, the cool part was, now how do I play this score and not sound like a percussive pianist?
Mm.
And it's a hard concept.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
get back to Brahms being such an orchestrator, and his ability, the sort of connecting pieces of how he does musical lines and rhythms, has been something that's really influenced me. But again, I could get into other genres and find any number of people who have had an influence on me
Right.
musically. So
Cool.
yeah.
We might have to have another installment then.
Yeah.
So we've done a lot of reflecting, and I thank you for that. Let's project a little bit and talk about your future plans.
Yeah. I don't have a laundry list.
Oh.
And I think part of it is because I don't know.
Yeah.
And I say that because, when I was 18, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I know what I like to do.
I see a pattern.
I definitely want to, I want to be released from a schedule that I have limited control over. Again, that's a freedom. It's a flexibility. I want to be able to sit at the piano and play or practice. I want to be able to play more once things get back to normal. I have a few people I want to reconnect with. My daughter raised in New York, so we want to continue to hopefully do those again.
Yeah.
One or two singers that I've known for many, many years. I'd like to do some recitals and things with them as a player. But I still like working with my hands. Over the years, in the various houses we lived in, I've torn out bathrooms and redone.
Oh, wow.
We have a couple of projects here I want to do. We've both, the beauty of being in higher ed, I traveled a lot over the years. And back when the kids were young, they came with, on some of the international stuff we did them as family trips in the summer. We didn't go to the beach. We didn't saved our money and frequent flyer miles and went with the family. So we've both been able to travel a lot. And I know people retire, they want to travel. It's on our list. But, for us, traveling could be get in the car and drive from here to Ohio. I mean,
right.
We lived so many places where we had to drive long distances that there's still so much of this country to see.
Yes.
And just be able to just, continue to experiment with things I'm curious about.
And maybe find new curiosities.
Yeah, it's true. One of the things I've loved, and if I say, or if there were a list of things, if I ever came back as somebody else, I might try to do. One of them, it would be to have a horse.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And when I was very young, 8, 9, 10 years old, I spent a couple of summers in a sleepaway camp in New Hampshire. And one of my activities was horseback riding.
Oh, fun.
And I loved the horses. And so I used to think about, as I was getting older, well, if I ever had space and I ever had time, I'd like to own a horse. And then you realize what a real 365-day commitment that really is.
I've had 4.
Have you really?
Yes.
Oh, I'm not
as a young person.
How cool.
Yeah.
There's but I've always thought that, if I look at places I would like to volunteer.
Yes.
And where we live out in Pennsylvania, and Dottie just sent me something yesterday that she saw of a horse therapy place right here in Milford. So
wonderful.
The opportunity to volunteer at doing that, volunteer musical things, and with things that I enjoy doing, where I'm not worried I have to make any type of a living doing it. To include playing, by the way. I do like to play, so
yes.
People will say, how much do we pay you? And if I'm in there for a job, I'll say, this is what it costs. But, for me to play for somebody where I feel like I'm feeding myself as a player.
Yes.
But I'm also giving something. And to me, I get a tremendous joy out of that. When I was in Lincoln, when I got to Lincoln, the president, they called him the chancellor at the university there, he had a thing called a speakers bureau. And it was really a collection of the various professors on campus that would go out in the state and talk about their specialty. Now, it was there to be sure that Lincoln, which is 50 miles from the Iowa border, rural western Nebraska, which is 450 miles the other direction, people out there in the rural parts of the state didn't forget about the University of Nebraska, because there were varying opinions about that, and Nebraska's not the only place. So he would send somebody who was working on nanotechnology, or somebody who was working on some business, something or other, who had a name at the campus. Well, he found that I played ragtime, and he said, and he saw a lecture thing that I did, and he said, would you want to be on the speakers bureau? I said, well, sure. So for 9 of the 10 years, I went all over. They booked it. If I stayed overnight, people fed me. They gave me. I didn't get any money, but where I played mostly were senior citizens, rotaries, service stuff.
Right.
And the not only did I feel connected to the state in a way that I didn't connect anywhere else that I've ever lived, including here, except New York City, but I got to do music for people. And when you watch the power, musicians know this. You sit in a room, you connect with them through the music, and you watch they completely transform. And of course, aside from the medical discoveries they've found the power of music in that sense, just the uplifting piece that you contribute. And so you go to a place, a senior citizens place, and many of them were assisted living, where people have various restrictions in their life or various levels of consciousness and so on. Then you play for them and talk about the rags, you tell them stories and so on. All of that was kind of cool, but you play for them and you see what that does for them. And so you say to yourself, when I retire, when I can do that without getting on a schedule that takes my hands, when I can do that, I'm going to do that. And that's in the list of the long answer to your question about what I want to do. And some days I just want to get up and do nothing.
And again, congratulations for that opportunity. It's wonderful. I want to ask a question that wasn't on my original list, but what would you say is the biggest lesson that you learned at FIT?
Patience.
Okay.
Because going back to what I said before, if you like to get things done, if you're a relatively organized and structured person, those of us who have that as an attribute know what it's like when you struggle like crazy and there are things that continue to slow you down, get in the way from your perspective. And you have to balance that against, is it worth the effort?
Right.
Some things are not worth the effort.
Right. The pick your battles issue.
So you say to yourself, thinking about all the human capital at FIT, and human capital, I say that in regardless of talents or skills, the people and the history of FIT. What I found was, and I still, if I walk out the door, it's probably something I still don't know that I've really harnessed the way I would be happy I have, is to learn the patience, is to continue to be reminded about the patience that you need to do with things that are worth doing. And because the people are worth doing it with and for.
Right.
And I don't mean that in terms of their worth as human beings, but in terms of the skills and the talents and the loyalty and all the stuff they bring to that. You say to yourself, I got to jump back in the pool. I got to separate. I got to go back. And again, a micro example of that is what we talked about a few minutes ago was the criteria for the non-classroom faculty. We went around and around and around and around with that.
Yes.
And at some point we were sort of not sure whether we'd ever come up with anything that was workable. And yet it was something that we had to be patient with, because there would be others who might not want to take the time to do it for whatever reason.
But the value of the end product made it, the patience for it sustainable.
That's right. Yeah. And so for me, I think over time, if I were to say if there's one thing I learned and continue to learn, it's about the value of patience.
Very good.
I think.
What would you like for people to remember about you in your role as Vice President of Academic Affairs?
Yeah, I would hope that they would remember that I was fair, or that I tried to be fair. that I was respectful, that I valued them and what they have to offer.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and as a teacher, there are still the students that I taught as my first group of freshmen are now 61 years old. And I have stayed connected with many of them through Facebook over the last 20 years. And again, these were kids that started as freshmen and were 4 years with me in the high school choir, sophomores, juniors, seniors. So you build a relationship with these, I call them kids because that was always the frame. But some of them, were, less than 10 years older than me, younger than me. But when you see what you invested in them as people and what they continue to tell you after the fact, unsolicited, about what they learned in your class, it was as much about music as it was about life in a bigger sense. And you say to yourself, it goes back to something that it made me think about the very first high school interview I went on as a 22-year-old. The principal asked me, I conducted the choir for my audition and blah, blah, blah. And I went in for a conversation with the principal. And he said to me, he said, if we had a situation where you were the only teacher your students saw every day for a fixed amount of time in a given year, what would you teach them? And immediately I knew I better not say music. I said and I thought about this, and what did I know as a 22-year-old other than what my instinct was? And it was really about, getting people to feel good about things and getting them engaged. I said I probably would just try to find ways to use music to help them learn about life experience.
Mm-hmm.
And how to interact with people and how to respect people and how to get along with people and blah, blah, blah. So for me, you hope that over the years, the last thing you want somebody to say about you is, look at all the money he raised, look at the great building he built, look at all the programs he started, but boy, he was a real bum. Or he was disrespectful and he walked on people to get other places. And again, I'm not tooting my own horn here, Karen, but my point is you want them to know that as a human being, you were sensitive to them, you cared about them, and you were willing, and there are times to know that when you didn't do that, you could be at least comfortable enough to have somebody tell you that.
Yes.
And learn from that. And so that's the piece I think that when you step back and meet your students that you had 10, 20, 30 years ago, those are the things they tell you. And they also tell you, boy, I stayed in choir and my kids all sang in church, and that I'm happy about that too. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I just want them to love their music and enjoy it. But when they say that, you were one of the best teachers we had, they don't have to tell me why. You know how kids are. Kids are very honest.
Yes.
And you know that if you were not a good human being, the kids would never say that.
Exactly.
And if you weren't somebody who was willing to live with flaws as well, the kids wouldn't say that. So to me, that's what you hope you leave somewhere, because that's a framework. That's an environment.
The scaffolding.
It's that's a great word. Yeah, scaffolding is definitely a great word. So that's what you hope.
I think you'll get your wish. Last question. What question did I not ask that you wish I had?
I don't know that there is one, Karen.
Well, are there any parting words that you'd like to share?
The danger when people ask me questions is they don't get one answer. They get 10 answers, or they get one answer with 20 parts. And I have to watch myself about that. I have a tendency to tell stories. But I think you gave me a lot of opportunities to tell stories, and
wanted to do it.
In telling you those stories, I had to build little fences in my mind to be sure. Yeah, I think as a final thing, you look back on things you've done, where you've been, and I think I look back on my time at FIT, but also the years that I've worked,
Mm.
and feel very fortunate that my dad never went to college, and my mother was a pianist and never really was able to realize that as a person, and I didn't realize that
Mm.
until I went to college as an older student and started studying the things that she would still play when I was going to sleep at night. And
Wow.
she practiced them every day, but she never really had a chance to do that. My dad didn't go to college, but he worked to try to hold on to um, white collar type jobs. He was an accountant, loved numbers.
Mhm.
But as he came in, he started working in the late 40s and came through at a period when you didn't need a college degree, but the older he got and the longer he was in, not having that degree was a liability.
Mhm.
And he struggled with his own sort of sense of accomplishment through his life as he measured that in having a job and a position and a salary, the things that were important to him in a good way. And so I watched that he looked back and didn't feel that he had been fulfilled or whatever. He, of course, we had a good family, so in the end, it's the picture's bigger than your job. But when I think
Sure.
back about the work that I've been able to do, I feel really fortunate to have ended up where I did, to have worked with the people I've worked with and for. Um, I would do it again. If you said to me, "What do you want to do with yourself when you're at about 18 years old?" and I'd say, the back of my mind, I had this experience. I would do this again.
That's so telling.
Yeah, and while I could think of a million other things I would have liked to do, when you look at the whole big picture and find common frames to think about that, forget the
Mhm.
job. There's things about each job I had that I liked better than other jobs, obviously. But when you think about the larger context of being able to work with people and engage with people and hopefully make a difference for them, just as they're making a difference for you,
Mhm.
um, those are the sort of things that sort of stay with you. And I just feel really fortunate to have been able to do that without a lot of struggles that people do have to go through for whatever the reason
Mhm.
they do.
Right.
The glass is always half full.
Yeah.
It really is if you think about it. There's
I
many, many.
do I do
Yeah,
think of that glass half full versus half empty and always try to fall on the side of half full.
yeah. There's always something to be because when you cast your current experience against what you learn about life experiences for other people,
Mm,
you just feel so blessed and so
very
lucky,
much.
so fortunate,
Yes.
and so um, you watch what people have gone through in the last 15 months.
Oh,
People,
indeed.
even if they weren't sick, people who didn't work, people who didn't have jobs, who have struggled, and people who care about it maybe more about what they do than you do. They,
It revealed so much vulnerability.
yeah, yeah. So you look back and you say to yourself, well, life could have gone in any number of directions. Whatever direction it went for me and my family, it's been one that I feel blessed to have had it, and hope I've given back as much or more than I've gotten from it, and just keep going while you can.
Well, I'm one voice, but you definitely gave so much, and I cannot thank you enough as one recipient of your
Well,
gifts and
thank you.
talents.
Thank you very much. It's been a real joy to work with you and
Oh,
everybody
thank you.
here.
Well, I have to say, this hour plus time of reflection has just been a delight. I hope for you, and I know
Very
will
much
be
so.
for viewers.
Very much so.
And I'll stop recording very soon. But Jack, if you'll stay on for just a second, I would appreciate it. And I
Sure.
want to thank all of our viewers, and certainly contact me, Karen Trivette, in the Gladys Marcus Library at FIT if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you for watching.